The call came in on a Tuesday morning, October 17th, 2001. Alan Bond's old CFO, Craig Semple, was sitting in his car outside the HIH Insurance headquarters on Park Street, Sydney. He did not go inside. He already knew what was waiting in there. A company worth nothing, a balance sheet full of lies, and 4 million Australians who had no idea their policies, their homes, their surgeries were backed by air. HIH Insurance was the second largest general insurer in Australia. When it collapsed on March 15, 2001, it left behind a $5.3 billion hole, the single largest corporate failure in Australian history. But the money wasn't stolen in one dramatic heist. It was consumed, slowly, quietly, over years of arrogance, incompetence, and deliberate blindness. And at the center of it all was one man who never believed the rules applied to him. Ray Williams was born in 1940. By all accounts, he was not brilliant. He was not visionary. What he was careful. Careful with the right people. Careful with the right image. He joined C.E. Heath International Holdings in 1971 as a junior underwriter, and he climbed. Not because of genius, because of patience and politics. By 1992, when C.E. Heath restructured and rebranded as HIH Insurance, Williams was running it. He was the CEO. He wore impeccably pressed suits and spoke in the measured cadence of a man who had rehearsed confidence for 30 years. The Australian business press called him steady, conservative, safe, the kind of man you trusted with risk because he seemed allergic to it. And for a while, it worked. HIH expanded aggressively through the 1990s. It acquired CIC Insurance in 1995. It swallowed FAI Insurances in January 1999 for $300 million, a deal that many inside the company immediately flagged as reckless. FAI was not a prize. FAI was a corpse dressed in a suit. Its liabilities had been deliberately concealed. Williams knew, or he should have known, and he approved the acquisition anyway. The man who sold him the corpse was Rodney Adler, FAI's director. He was 38 years old, charming, well-connected, and utterly shameless. Adler had spent years propping up FAI's stock with undisclosed loans routed through shell entities. When Williams came knocking with $300 million, Adler did not warn him. He cashed out. Then he joined the HIH board. He sat in the same boardroom as the men he had deceived, and he smiled, and nobody asked a single uncomfortable question. Behind the doors of HIH's Sydney headquarters, where the carpet was thick and the air smelled faintly of old paper and printer toner, the numbers were already rotting. Williams had authorized a culture where underwriting losses were buried. Reserves were set artificially low. Claims liabilities, money owed to real people for real disasters, were quietly understated year after year. By 1999, HIH had moved into the United States market, writing policies it had no actuarial basis to price. Losses piled up in California, in construction underwriting, in workers' compensation. The American operation alone bled over $900 million, and Williams kept signing off on optimistic forecasts. He kept rewarding loyalty over honesty. The auditors, Arthur Andersen, kept signing clean opinions, the same Arthur Andersen that would later implode alongside Enron. Their Sydney office reviewed HIH's books every year. They missed everything, or perhaps they chose to. On March 15, 2001, HIH Insurance was placed into provisional liquidation. The administrator appointed was Tony McGrath of KPMG. When his team walked into the offices, they found records in disarray, reserves that had been understated by at least $800 million, and evidence of transactions that had no commercial logic except to inflate the appearance of solvency. The victims were not hedge funds or institutional investors. They were builders who could no longer insure their sites, hospitals that had to turn patients away, families who had submitted home insurance claims after bushfires and floods and would never be paid. A woman named Patricia Skinner, a 63-year-old retired schoolteacher from Newcastle, had a $180,000 claim pending for storm damage to her home. She'd been waiting 8 months when HIH collapsed. She never received a cent. The government eventually stepped in with a $640 million relief fund. It covered a fraction of the damage. The Royal Commission began in August 2001, led by Justice Neville Owen. Over 17 months, it heard from 247 witnesses, reviewed over 170,000 documents, and produced a 900-page report that described HIH's collapse as a failure of culture, ethics, and governance at every single level. Justice Owen used one phrase in his final report that still echoes. He called it a culture of self-delusion. Ray Williams was charged in 2002. He stood in the New South Wales Supreme Court in a grey suit that seemed too large for him, as though he had shrunk inside it. He pleaded guilty to 3 counts of obtaining financial advantage by deception, specifically to authorizing $3.5 million in improper payments, including $1.95 million to himself as a retirement benefit while the company was hemorrhaging. He was sentenced to 4 years and 6 months in prison, with a non-parole period of 2 years and 9 months. Rodney Adler was convicted in 2005 of 4 criminal charges, including disseminating false information to the Australian Stock Exchange and obtaining money by false pretenses. He served 2.5 years of a 4.5-year sentence. Upon release, he gave interviews. He wrote op-eds. He spoke at business conferences about ethics. Australia, to its credit, mostly refused to listen. The HIH auditor from Arthur Andersen, Bart Kenner, was never criminally charged. The board members who asked no questions were never charged. The investment bankers who advised on the FAI acquisition faced no personal consequences. In Australia's largest corporate collapse, the blast radius was enormous. The accountability was surgical in its selectivity. Ray Williams was released in 2005. He moved quietly out of the public eye. There were no documentaries made celebrating his rehabilitation, no TED Talks, no memoir. He simply disappeared into the suburban silence of a country that had trusted him with everything, and spent years rebuilding what he had consumed. What stays with you about HIH is not the number, not the $5.3 billion. It is the texture of the collapse. The fact that it happened in plain sight, in annual reports, in boardrooms with windows overlooking Sydney Harbour. That the auditors signed off, that the board nodded along, that a 63-year-old woman in Newcastle had a tarp on her roof for 8 months, while Ray Williams authorized nearly $2 million to himself. The money was never really the point. The point was the certainty, the absolute unexamined certainty that someone else would pay the bill.